Tonight on Primetime Politics, putting the carbon tax to a vote.
All of Trudeau's MPs sold out their constituents and voted to make their home heating more expensive.
The motion to suspend the carbon tax on all home heating goes before Parliament, with the parties shifting alliances just before the final vote. Coming up, we'll speak with MPs about the motion's defeat and why each party voted the way they did. Also,
I think they should just get rid of the carbon tax and work with the provinces on something that would actually help.
the Council of the Federation meets in Halifax to discuss housing, healthcare, and what many described as the lack of fairness in the federal carbon tax. Coming up, we will speak with Premier Scott Moe of Saskatchewan and Premier Blaine Higgs of New Brunswick. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Well, the Conservative motion to expand a carbon tax break to all home heating came to a vote today, with the Tories getting some last-minute support from the NDP. Take a look at what happened.
Mr. Meow.
Yeas pour 135, 135. Nays contre 186, 186.
Je déclare la motion rejetée.
Given that the NDP was forced to flip-flop on Trudeau's plan to quadruple the tax, he had to find a new partner to keep him in power and avoid this non-confidence vote from passing. And who was there to save him? The Separatists. So he's now signed on with the Separatists to divide Canadians into two separate classes: those who will have to pay carbon tax on their home heat, and a small minority who will get a pause from the pain.
So, the NDP siding with Conservatives in this matter, but the Bloc Québécois voting with the government to kill the motion. And with that, let's go to the foyer of the House of Commons. We're now joined by Adam van Koeverden, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, Conservative Deputy Leader Melissa Lantsman, and NDP House Leader Peter Julian. Hello to the three of you.
Hi.
Adam, I'm going to begin with you here because the Conservative motion was defeated, but the decision to put a pause on the carbon tax for home oil heating is still being called unfair in many parts of the country. Are you not concerned about the affordability challenges all Canadians face right now, not just those who use oil for heating?
Absolutely we are, Michael, and it's worth mentioning that home heating oil is extremely expensive. It's also the dirtiest way and the most emissions-intensive way to heat one's home, and that's what we're trying to phase out. We're trying to phase out home heating oil in favor of free heat pumps right across the country to ensure that the most emissions-intensive way of heating one's home is phased out, just like coal was, and it is underway, I should say, because some provinces still burn some coal. But I remember back in 2005, Ontario still burned a lot of coal for our energy, and unfortunately we had 30 or 40 smog days that summer. And since phasing out coal, we've had far cleaner air in Ontario. Canadians across the country deserve cleaner air. They deserve affordable home heating, and the home heating oil situation is that the vast majority of people that rely on home heating oil are lower income, and it's extremely expensive. And one of the reasons it's expensive is because of the war in Europe, and disproportionately higher costs for that product have made it both unaffordable, and it remains the dirtiest and the most emissions intensive. So we're phasing it out across the country. Heat pumps are an effective and efficient way to heat one's home. It's far, far more environmentally friendly, and our plan will do just that while maintaining the integrity of a carbon pricing program right across Canada. Okay,
Melissa, what's your response to that? Because oil heating is carbon heavy, and doesn't the government have the right to bring about a policy that gives people a chance to get off of it by saving some money? And really, how different is this from past policies, for example, the coal-powered electricity that Adam was talking about?
Well, I think that's a lot of words to say that we made a political decision because our poll numbers were in the gutter to give a tax break to some Canadians and not all Canadians. That's exactly what happened. In fact, the Minister of Rural Economic Affairs said so herself, that if you wanted a tax break, you needed to vote in more Liberals. And our question is that for all of those Liberals that represent all of the other ridings in this country, well, why don't those Canadians get a tax break? If it is in fact the dirtiest way to heat your house, which it is, why would you incentivize people to do that with a with pausing the carbon tax? And I'll just remind you that it is a pause of the carbon tax, meaning that in 3 years, when the Liberals want to go back to the polls, they're going to continue to quadruple the carbon tax, and that's with the help of the NDP, and today with the help of their new coalition partners, the Separatists. But the NDP also voted 16 times to raise the carbon tax on Canadians. In fact, Mr. Julian, who's sitting with me right here, voted 11 times to increase the carbon tax. So they're also, a day late and a dollar short on this policy. And the Carbon Tax Coalition continues to work together to increase the prices on gas, groceries, and home heating for all Canadians.
Okay, Peter, interesting to hear that, since your party did vote with the Conservatives on this bill. What is also interesting to me is that your party didn't say that last week. Has your equation for balancing affordability and environmental concerns changed?
No, not at all. I mean, the Conservatives normally have crazy, wacky motions that nobody can support. This time, they actually wrote something that was comprehensible. And we saw the decision that was made 2 weeks ago by the Liberals as politically motivated, improvised at the last minute, back of a napkin thinking. So the House will have the opportunity tomorrow with the NDP motion to actually look at a comprehensive adult policy, not the kind of flippant stuff that the Conservatives normally do, and not the improvised nature of what the Liberals do. So tomorrow we'll be voting on taking the GST off of home heatings right across the country. That includes provinces like British Columbia and Quebec that have their own system. So it actually includes everybody, unlike the Conservative approach. It would ensure that everybody has access to heat pumps, and this is something that the Liberals have fallen far short on. They like to announce programs, but they haven't actually put it into place. And so we want to make sure every Canadian family that wants to can actually install that heat pump. That's good for the environment. It's also good for their pocketbook. And then finally, we pay for the program by an excess profits tax on the oil and gas CEOs. We've seen oil and gas profits that are enormous, and we simply see that excess profits can serve a better benefit, which is making sure Canadians have access to heat pumps. So the NDP, we're the adults in the room yet again, and what we're doing is putting forward comprehensive policy tomorrow that members of Parliament will be voting on, and we expect that members of Parliament will adopt the NDP plan, which is good for the environment and good for families that are struggling to make ends meet.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Mr. van Koeverden, what your response will be tomorrow, your party, because the Conservative leader right now says that Liberal MPs have sold out their constituents by voting against a tax break. Are you concerned about constituents turning against you? What do you say to them about how your party stands on affordability again?
Well, first of all, Milton has hundreds of people that use home heating oil, so this is good news for them that we are phasing out those dirty home heating oil. Milton is where I represent. That's my home, and I agree with Mr. Julian that most of the Conservative motions are nonsense, and I'm frankly disappointed that the NDP capitulated today and voted in favor of a motion that was similarly flippant. But I also have been reflecting on the fact that progressive Conservative voters across Canada used to be able to rely on the Conservatives for a little bit of leadership on fighting climate change. I think about people like Michael Chong, who I used to really look up to as a Conservative in that caucus, who stood up against Stephen Harper and said climate change is a real threat. He ran on a leadership campaign that was focused on a carbon tax, which was revenue neutral, just like ours. He unfortunately lost that leadership campaign, but even more recently, people like Preston Manning and others have advocated for a carbon tax. They know that it is a market-based instrument that works to lower our emissions. But even more recently than that, Aaron O'Toole and my colleague, Ms. Lantsman, ran on a commitment to price carbon just in 2021. So you don't have to go back very far to see how quickly the Conservatives have turned on their heels, turned against climate change. Canadians haven't given up on fighting climate change. They insist that we continue to lower our emissions and fight climate change. And it's really disappointing to see a lack of leadership from the Conservatives, from anybody in the Conservative Party on this. And today it was really unfortunate to see the NDP capitulate and vote with the Conservatives on stopping our efforts to fight climate change in that regard.
Okay, Peter, I'll get to you in a second. But Melissa, I do wonder, because here is your party. You want to get rid of the carbon tax altogether. What would your party do instead to ensure environmental progress?
Well, look, we're going to focus on technology and not taxes. This isn't a climate change plan. It is a tax plan, and it punishes Canadians on everything they buy buy and everything they do and everywhere they go. They haven't reached a single environmental target that they themselves have set with this carbon tax. And the parliamentary budget officer who they appointed has said that Canadians don't get back more than they spend on the carbon tax. So calling it a climate change policy, I think is, frankly, I think is not true. And we'd like to see the Liberals come to the table and stop punishing Canadians who, at 2 million people have eaten in a food bank in a single month in this country. Canadians are wearing jackets at home because they can't afford the price of home heating. This is punishing Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and now the Liberals are siding with the separatists in this country to punish one group of Canadians while giving tax relief to a small number of Canadians, 3% instead of 97%. They should go back to the drawing board and axe the tax for every single Canadian everywhere in this country for good.
Okay, Peter, last word to you here. You heard Adam say he's disappointed in your party for voting against the government. Are you tired of the supply and confidence agreement? Is this a move against that?
Well, first off, the capitulation was 2 weeks ago when Mr. Trudeau, just on the back of a napkin, just rewrote their climate change policy. So we take no lessons from the Liberals. But you asked Ms. Lantsman a question about the climate crisis, and she was unable to give a single thing that the Conservatives would do, which shows how devoid the Conservative Party is under Mr. Poilievre's leadership when it comes to anything to touch the environment or climate change. Tomorrow, the NDP is presenting a comprehensive policy. It is an adult policy. It's not something on the back of a napkin like Mr. Trudeau. It's not something that denies climate change like Mr. Poilievre. It's actually something under Jagmeet Singh's leadership that will bring real benefit to people. And so that motion will be debated and hopefully adopted by the majority of members of Parliament. It will allow for heat pumps to go to Canadians. It will ensure that the GST is taken off immediately, which helps people right across the country, including British Columbia and Quebec, and will ensure that the excess profits that big oil and gas have been earning over the course of the last few years actually serves a public good, and that makes sure that we can pay for the heat pump program for Canadians. This is the kind of comprehensive policy that Canadians expect, and given the theatrics of Mr. Poilievre and the improvisation of Mr. Trudeau, it's about time that we have a leader like Jagmeet Singh that actually steps up for Canadians.
Okay, well, we'll be watching the vote tomorrow. But for now, Adam van Koeverden, Melissa Lantsman, Peter Julian, thank you for the time this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
To Halifax now, where the country's premiers gathered for a meeting of the Council of the Federation. And while housing and healthcare were big topics of discussion, the debate in Ottawa about the federal carbon tax and home heating also made the agenda.
One immediate action that we discussed as premiers that can be taken to address the affordability challenges is to ensure that all Canadians are treated fairly by the federal government when it comes to the federal carbon tax and home heating. And it's certainly not lost on our group that the Prime Minister has not convened a full in-person First Minister's meeting since 2018. So we again reiterate our call for a First Minister's meeting.
Well, joining us now in Halifax is the Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe. Premier, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Michael.
So a big agenda today. You're talking about housing, affordability, health care, but without a doubt, the closing news conference seemed to be very dominated by the carbon tax. What exactly was being said about that behind closed doors?
You know, the discussion wasn't so much about the policy and whether, various jurisdictions across Canada felt it was the right policy or the wrong policy or an effective policy for that matter. But it was about the most recent decision by the federal government to exempt home heating fuel and how that was, inherently unfair to Canadian families that may use a different heating source, may have invested already in a different heating source, or may not have any other choice outside of, in Saskatchewan's case, we have about 15% of our population that uses electric or propane, which will not be impacted by this decision. And so the inherent unfairness of the federal government's decision to Canadian families was really the focus of the discussion today.
You use the word unfairness, but of course you've heard it from Justin Trudeau himself. He argues the government program here is meant to be a targeted program. Doesn't Ottawa have the right to bring about a targeted program from time to time, if not legal, at least precedent?
Well, he said that home heating fuel is a dirty way to heat your home. Well, by that, and so his solution to that is to pause the carbon tax and invest in heat pumps in the transitionary mechanism. By that same metric, he should pause the carbon tax on natural gas and coal-fired electricity and invest in the transitionary sources of electrical generation in a place like Saskatchewan. And so it just doesn't add up. And by excluding other Canadians that may be on equally expensive heating sources like electricity, like propane, it just is inherently unfair to Canadians. And I think the premiers unanimously felt that was the case. We most certainly have felt that's the case in Saskatchewan, and we've indicated that if the federal government doesn't bring some common sense and logic to this conversation and make what we feel is the right decision in treating Canadian families fairly, we'll do what we can to treat Saskatchewan families as fairly by making a similar decision that we may be able to make in Saskatchewan as the federal government has made that predominantly impacts Atlantic Canada.
Okay, well, let's pick up on that point because, of course, you and I have talked about this potential of not collecting the carbon tax come the new year in order to give people in Saskatchewan, as you say, an equal break when it comes to the carbon tax. We heard from Premier Higgs of New Brunswick saying that he, too, is going to ask his legal team to look into a possibility for his province to extend the tax break to others. Are you now looking at some type of joint legal action with other premiers when it comes to the carbon tax?
Well, what we would hope is there's some time here and a vote today that the federal government really revisits this decision. We would hope that the federal government, isn't in the business or intentionally treating Canadian families unfairly. Regardless of what a federal minister might come out and say with respect to how many Liberals are voted in Atlantic Canada versus the Prairie provinces. We would hope that the federal government is, always looking as to how they can treat all Canadian families fairly, regardless of the number of federal MPs they have elected and for which party. So that's the answer to this. We may be able to take some action, very controversial action in Saskatchewan, utilizing our publicly owned Crown utility companies, but that would still not impact all Saskatchewan families. If we took action in the natural gas space, for example, that's about 85% of our families. If we happen to go a step further and take action in our electricity space and impact those that are utilizing electric heat in northern Indigenous or rural communities, that wouldn't still leave those that are utilizing propane as a fuel source paying this inherently unfair carbon tax. And so the right thing to do is for the federal government to revisit this decision, treat all Canadian families, including those in Saskatchewan, fairly.
Mm-hmm. At one point in today's news conference, Premier Smith used Quebec as an example. Now, it had to do with housing, but the point that she was making had to do with provincial consultation. And I'm wondering what you would say to that when it comes to the carbon tax, to housing, to pharmacare, to healthcare. What would you say about the need for provincial consultation? And do you, as Premier of Saskatchewan, need to enact something that would make that necessary, as Quebec has done with housing and negotiating with the province rather than municipalities?
There's broad consideration, and I would say support for looking at, when it comes to housing and expanding our housing opportunities, whether they be in our largest cities like Toronto and Vancouver, for example, that where they do have a challenge with needing additional houses. We have a challenge as well. In other communities, for example, we have underfunded housing in our Indigenous communities, which is primarily a federal responsibility. And so when it comes to housing in our urban centers and how we're supporting that housing through clean and wastewater infrastructure, through recreational infrastructure, and ensuring that there is recreational facilities there to attract families, the province needs to be at the table. The federal government simply cannot go over or around the province straight to a municipality, for example. We all have a voice and a role in expanding housing in an organized and constructive format. The federal government through funding, the provincial government through the tools that we have, and the municipal governments. And so to exclude one of those would be short-sighted, and there's a real interest from the provinces in ensuring that doesn't happen. And Quebec has already taken a few of those steps, but the provinces are looking at even further further steps.
To the issue of the fact that there hasn't been a First Minister's Conference in a number of years now, what do you think needs to happen there?
Well, I think we do have to get together as First Ministers across this nation to regroup. And it's been a challenging number of years. It's not to say that as First Ministers we haven't had discussions, but an official First Ministers Conference, in-person First Ministers Conference has not occurred since 2018. So it is time for us to regroup and to start talking about strategic infrastructure, not just housing, but how we are supporting that housing in our communities, whether they be Northern Indigenous communities, whether they be growing and vibrant towns and cities in Saskatchewan, or whether they be our largest centers in Canada, like Vancouver and Toronto, that have their challenges as well. Always with an eye to being fair to all Canadians, but I would say also revisiting our strategic national infrastructure, like our corridors that are transporting goods to ports ultimately. And those are conversations that I think are very impactful for the health and wealth of our nation, not just in the next year or two, but for the next number of decades. And so it's time to come together.
Premier Scott Moe, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Well, let's continue the discussion now with the Premier of New Brunswick, Blaine Higgs. Premier, thank you for taking the time this evening.
You're very welcome.
Now, as I said to Premier Moe, I kept hearing the word fairness at the closing news conference today, but when it comes to this pause in the carbon tax on home heating oil, really, it's meant to benefit or does benefit Atlantic Canadians. How is it not fair to New Brunswickers?
Well, I mean, I think it does benefit Atlantic Canadians. We know that there was a kind of a situation here and where we're high content of oil in our heating homes in all of our Atlantic provinces. But I think it's reasonable to say that it should apply to all heating mediums. And that's what my colleagues have been asking for. And the principle of the carbon tax, even though I don't believe it's been effective in achieving what it may have intended to do, was that it would be uniform across the country. So this little caveat, was carried out by the Prime Minister for rather, non-climate action reasons, and I think the point is it should be uniform across the country.
You say for non-climate action reasons. Are you certain of that?
Well, it seems pretty self-evident that there's been such a hard line on the climate tax, but I would say on the carbon tax, I would say that we should have an assessment here of why was it put in place originally? What was it intended to achieve? And is it achieving that? Because right now, affordability is an issue across this country. I feel that we are basically penalizing Canadians for a very small gain, if any gain whatsoever, because it's hard to measure. But it's certainly not hard to measure in the affordability clock. And we could be a world player here to reduce emissions. And instead, we're focused on our own little bubble here in Canada and imposing hardship across this country for unnecessary reasons. But we could have an impact on countries, let's say that like China, that are running 1,100 coal plants, and our energy sources could be offsetting Russian supply to Europe, and supply and shutting down coal plants in Europe by gas supply. There's a huge window here for us to be a major contributor to climate change, and it's not from looking within our own country and penalizing every citizen in this country.
Except that we did hear Premier Eby today, British Columbia, basically credit carbon pricing for pushing his province to use less carbon-heavy forms of energy. And he makes the argument it does work. What do you say to that?
Well, my point would be this. If he thinks that climate change is going to happen in Canada, if we become carbon neutral in Canada at 1.5% of world emissions, it will have no impact on the emissions and the issue that we have across the globe on world emissions. If you look at major emitting countries like China, like India, like the U.S., I mean, they're focused on industry and not on the people. And they're, in the case of cheap energy, China is focused on coal because it's cheap energy. In the case of the U.S. and reducing emissions, they're focused on industry making those changes. They're focused on technology. They're not focused on penalizing the average consumer. And that's what we do. And I'm sure both Quebec and BC, they have revenue that's coming in on this program that they've had for some time, and they don't want to lose that revenue. But I'm saying right now in our country, we have an affordability issue that's been created by federal policies, and it needs to be corrected. And we need to think bigger on emissions that we can actually have a major impact on across the globe.
Now, as you're speaking right now, it occurs to me that when you look down the table, it does seem that the provinces with the biggest beef on the carbon tax are still Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick. Has this suspension on home heating oil tax, is that just resurrecting old concerns here, though?
Well, let's just think about how did it come about, and I mentioned about the polls in the country seem to have an impact on the federal decision to implement a heating oil carbon rebate or suspend the carbon tax for 3 years. So all of a sudden, climate change doesn't become such a big issue because the polls are down. Now, I would say that the issue here really, again, is let's do an analysis of what the carbon tax is doing. Let's have a scientific look at the impact we can make in the country. And that's my point, is that we're thinking too small here. And we're not going to solve it unless we get world momentum here on climate reduction and climate emissions reduction.
It was noted during the closing news conference that the Prime Minister has not called for a First Minister's meeting in quite some time. Will the Premiers invite him to a meeting to talk about the issue of taxation and the carbon tax regime in general?
Yes, I'm sure we will. And it was also about infrastructure as well, because we're seeing more and more projects that are being unilaterally picked in different communities within our respective provinces and basically bypassing the provincial government. That's not how the system is supposed to work, and that's what the other point made today, that we will look at legislation, kind of collectively across this country, but it will emulate legislation that already exists in Quebec. Quebec government negotiate for the province, and then they deal with the funding models throughout the province. But we're seeing more and more of the federal government going direct to municipalities, and that was the point that was being made.
Premier Higgs, really appreciate the time as always. Thank you for this.
You're very welcome. Have a good evening.
Well, a look now at the other stories making headlines today. Quebec public sector workers held a one-day strike today, with education workers, social workers, and some hospital employees delaying the start of their work week or working at lower capacity. 4 different unions representing over 400,000 workers organized the limited strike, pushing back on the Quebec provincial government's latest contract offer. The unions say they will strike again near the end of the month if the offer doesn't improve. To New York, where Donald Trump testified today in the civil case against him, the judge has already ruled Trump committed fraud by inflating the value of his properties. But the judge must now decide if the former U.S. president should be fined $250 million and banned from doing future business in New York. Instead of answering the questions put to him, though, Mr. Trump used much of his time railing against the proceedings today and New York's Attorney General. The civil trial is just one of many legal battles Donald Trump faces. He is also facing several criminal indictments. Still no word tonight on when Canadians trapped in Gaza may be able to get to safety in neighboring Egypt. Over the weekend, the Rafah border crossing, the only way out of those stuck in the territory, was suddenly closed after an Israeli strike on an ambulance in Gaza. It has since reopened, but only for Egyptians and some previously approved foreign citizens. Global Affairs Canada says there are about 450 Canadians registered in Gaza and the West Bank, with the government saying Canadians will be able to cross into Egypt in the coming days. And an explosion at Canada's High Commission in Nigeria has killed at least 2 people and injured 2 others. This, according to emergency officials in the capital city of Abuja. The Foreign Affairs Minister, Melanie Joly, confirmed the incident, saying in a social media post, Canada is, quote, working to shed light on what caused this situation. And that is our program for this Monday evening. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. I'm Michael Serapio. Primetime Politics will be back tomorrow night, but up next, Esther Bégin avec l'essentiel.